what's up you guys, this is Rob from The Gay Guy Plays, and the night is young, so let's get dressed to kill with the Twilight Palette. Now I'm gonna be 100% honest with you, this palette is a strange mix of rich browns and oranges, muted yellows and greens, and some very saturated purples. While this palette does have a bit of difficulty complementing itself, in my opinion it has some amazing standalone tones that can be integrated into tons of looks as accent and energy colors. I'm gonna warn you right now though, it's gonna feel like we're burning through this palette. The way it's set up, a majority of the gradients we're gonna have to hit line by line. So, as with all standard palettes, you can pick this one up under the Equipment tab in the market for 75 plat. So the first gradient is a rich tan that starts off almost camel color and finishes off as a very dark warm brown. Its tonality almost makes me think of leather in the Wild West. Just keep in mind there is a very similar gradient in the Fire palette. The next row is much more muted than the previous, starting with a washed out brown and slowly transitions into a rich dark chocolate. While I like both, I do prefer this over the first one as I like the finish of muted tones a little bit better. Plus, these tones are currently palette exclusive. The next gradient is a bit strange as it starts off with this kind of puke toned cool yellow, which slowly turns into a warm toned milk chocolate. Now, the first three are actually pretty nice as energy colors, but I much prefer the last two used as accent tones on a frame. Now the next bar is where it gets really interesting. The gradient starts off as a very pale eggshell which quickly warms into a dusty orange. While the last two squares on this are a bit too saturated for my taste, they do make great accent tones. The one thing to note is that this whole row makes for some beautiful energy colors. The next gradient is very similar to the previous row, however it is more muted and does start off a bit darker. Now usually I like muted, but in this case it looked kinda icky on the base frame, excluding the very last box. But as a saving grace, much like the previous gradient, the whole row looks fantastic when used for energy. This gradient is a weird one too. Starting off as a pinkier eggshell tone, is that a thing? I don't know. Slowly transitioning into a cool toned camel, which honestly in my opinion just looks like diarrhea. As compared to the previous rows, I'm not a huge fan of this one. Okay, so we are finally at my favorite gradient in this whole friggin' palette. This green is love, this green is life. While the first two are kind of blah, as the tone darkens up it turns into this amazing dusty green that you won't be able to find in any current palettes. The deeper tones make great accent colors and are some of my favorite energy colors. The next gradient starts off with a slightly washed out goldenrod and finishes with a strong red that leans very slightly to the orange side. You can't really catch it unless you apply it as an energy color where it goes straight red-orange on you. The following row hits you with a muted orange and finishes with a muted red. Now this red as compared to the previous row is quite balanced, which is made even more evident when it's used to customize energy. Both of these rows also make great accent colors and aside from that balanced red are completely unique to this palette. Alrighty, now we are hitting the clusterfuck of purples. To be honest with you, I'm gonna say the same thing about a majority of these tones, so I figure I'll sum it up right here and just highlight anything that I think is notable. A lot of these purples, even the chalky tones, are a little too saturated for me. However, that does mean that they will be go-tos for those of you who love brights or really bold gem tones. As for me, I'm only really comfortable with saying that they're going to make great energy colors. Now, let's jump in. The first gradient starts off with a light purple and finishes off with a balanced purple. The following gradient is very similar to the previous, however it is pinkier in tone and slightly more muted. Now this one starts off as a punchier pink violet, but actually deepens into a beautiful pruny gem tone. This is definitely one of the few violets that I'd reach for, but do be aware there is a very similar gradient available in the Lotus palette. However, this one is slightly more saturated and finishes off a bit deeper. The next row continues this dusty, chalky trend with a periwinkle that graduates into a muted blue violet. And much like the previous gradient, there are similar tones to this in the Lotus palette, but this is slightly warmer and deeper in tone. Moving on, our next row is another saturated pinky violet, which surprisingly becomes more muted and shifts into a usable, almost blue violet. Now, this is where things start to get really saturated. This gradient starts off with a strong, warm violet and finishes into a really nice bright blue. The next gradient starts off with another almost blue violet and quickly shifts into a deep navy blue. Now, this navy and the blue from the previous row are quite nice. However, upon further inspection, identical tones can be found in the Infested and Classic Saturated palette. Now, this last set is what I like to refer to as the Barney the Dinosaur gradients. These magentas are extremely saturated, but do finish off in some very rich, deep aubergines. They can't be found in any other palette. I quite like the darkest tone in this set. Now, with that out of the way, let's get dressed. So all in all, the Twilight palette is almost like two palettes in one. The first set providing some gorgeous autumnal tones that honestly give me this weathered leather and kind of Wild West old-timey feeling. I don't think that there's another palette that gives off that kind of vibe, and honestly, that fucking green makes it. Now, the second set is definitely what I'd call the Lotus Palette Part 2. This is for those of you obsessed with purple, and while I wasn't a fan of too many of the tones, the richer, deeper end of the set is quite beautiful. Now, for players who are a bit limited in their color selection, I would only suggest picking this up after you've gotten something with a few more base tones. There's maybe one usable eggshell tone, but aside from that, I found myself having to dip into other palettes. And like I said previously, this palette does have some issues matching itself. Now, for you palette junkies out there, the warmer side honestly is definitely a must-have for me, especially the red oranges, and as you know, I still can't get Ogre that green. So thank you all for watching another episode of Dressed to Kill. Be sure to check out the previous episodes, as well as the description box below to put in your input as to which palette I should review next. Now, don't forget to do all the things that I ask you to do at the end of every one of these, and as always, stay drop dead gorgeous.